Thank you, Father, for coming today to let us interview you about your history at SLUH. As I understand it, you were a graduate of the class of '52. Can you tell us how you got into SLUH and what led to your...
I think probably barely I got in, but anyway, what's odd about it is all my brothers and all my first cousins went to CBC. So when we have and I'm the only one on either side, both my mother's side and my father's side, who did not go to CBC. So when we get together, I just tell them, well, you guys, you know, you're great people, but nobody's perfect, and you made a big mistake. But we had an entrance exam in those days, similar to what you fellows had, and anyway, by the grace of God and ignorance of administrators, I got in. Father Van, Maury Van was our principal at the time. Great man.
And what happened after you graduated from SLUH High? Where did you go?
I went to Florissant for 4 years, the Valley of the Flowers, and we did basically our college stuff there, with the exception we didn't do any math or science. They didn't have that. Then we went to Fuse for 3 years of philosophy and get your major and try to get your master's degree. Then I came here to teach as a scholastic from, 59 to 62. Then to the dead center of the USA, St. Mary's, Kansas. And believe me, it was dead. 1,200 people in the town. The largest thing in the town was the Dairy Queen. We didn't have any money to go. And the food was rotten. It's like all college kids, I guess. But we had a slogan, because we lived up the hill on the campus a couple of blocks from the dining room, and the slogan was, never have so many walk so far for so little.
So you and Mr. Martell had some common roots there in St.
Yeah,
Mary's.
Paul was born in St. Mary's and was a great football player there, I believe, and basketball. I don't know, I don't think he played football in high school. I don't think they had it. Yeah, yeah, but he was a great basketball player, and that's the link. Maury Van Akron, who, you know, had been an All-American basketball player at Creighton himself, Father Van Akron, he did theology at St. Mary's. We all did in those days, and he was way ahead of me, of course, but he ended up coaching Paul in basketball there. And then later, when Paul came here, Van recommended him to Jerry Sheehan because Van had taken Gene Hart to Rock College as athletic director. And I think, so Van knew all about Paul and had followed him at Miege in Kansas City. He was at Miege for a couple of years, then he came here.
And you started here as a scholastic in what year?
59, the fall of 59. We taught Latin, yeah, we did. Almost all of us, Latin or English.
And you ran a certain part of the athletic department, which was known as the Cage.
Right.
Can you tell us about that? 'Cause
Surely.
I don't think there is one anymore.
No, there is not one, but Bob Costello and I, Eddie Gibbons preceded me, and he went to theology, and I took his place with Bob Costello for 1 year and then 2 years with Mike Durso. And basically, at the beginning of the year, as you fellas know, you'd turn in a towel and socks, shorts, athletic supporter, t-shirt. And then we had 7 or 8 grant and aid kids and these big commercial washers and dryers, so we'd always wash that stuff. As soon as you'd give it to us each day, then we'd have a replacement, and you know, for hygienic purposes and also to keep the odors down out of the locker room.
And and you taught Latin for how many years?
I taught Latin for 3 years, and 1 year I taught speech. When Father Divine died, Blanton had to take his one of his English classes, so I picked up Blanton's speech class. That was the blind leading the blind, but anyway, I did.
Part of what we've done in some of our interviews with other people, Mr. Martell included, is do some word association. So if I throw out a name, we'd appreciate if you'd comment on them a little bit.
Okay.
How about Father Kellett?
The Big Billiken. Great man. He was fabulous in terms of being a Pied Piper with kids. He was very easy to work with. He was our boss. That is, all the scholastics that worked downstairs in the cage. Kellett was the associate athletic director. I forgot what title he had or something like that. And he didn't do scheduling, but he did a lot of the other stuff. And he'd always, as you recall, in those days, we'd pack that old gym, and we'd be there. He'd sell tickets, and then we'd be taking the tickets in the door. And sometimes he'd put 2,000 people in there at $2 a pop. Well, then, usually sometime during the week, he would say, and he was very bright, but he stuttered, and so he'd always put these words in, just also. And when he was teaching, it'd be the just also genitive case in Latin. But he'd say, Ralph, we shall just also go out after the game tonight. It'd be a Friday night. And he'd take us over to Ruggeri's for adult beverages, which were not available in the Jesuit community in those days.
I understand they had some of those down in the Mr. Bartell's office after football games.
Yeah, they did.
But athletic meetings down there?
No, we didn't get in on that. The coaches did, but no, Phil would take us to the Hill.
Very good. How about Father Bailey? Can you comment on him?
Yes. Terrific man, very smart, very practical, great with getting benefactors. He started the auction here, and he learned how to refinish furniture himself, and he did that, and then he taught that to Brother Witz and to some other people on his crew, and it still goes on today. I think the other thing that he did, he started the Alumni Service Corps. Now, Tom Cummings likes to take credit for that, but the fact of the matter is Bailey, because I was at the meeting, as was Cummings and Woody Boyan from DeSmet, and it was Bailey's idea. And the Alumni Service Corps is basically the program that still goes on today, whereby college graduates with a degree give us a year of service, and in return we pay for their medical, we give them a house to stay in, we pay them a measly salary. I think it's now like $400 a month. It started, it was less than that. And the use of a car. And the idea behind that originally was to keep the youthful element in the schools, because this is at a time when vocations were down, and we wanted to keep the youthful element that we always had with the scholastics, and that was really Bailey's idea. And it got implemented, and it's still going today. He was a great athlete also, as well as a scholar. He was a very smart guy, but he was also a great athlete in high school, they tell me. And I know he was a good golfer.
How about Father Hagen?
Yeah. Phenomenal memory for names. He used to come into the homerooms. That's how he memorized the names. He'd come in the homerooms, and he had pictures that he had taken of all the freshmen. He'd be in there every day. And if you moved a kid, he wanted to know if you moved him from one seat to another, because that'd screw up his memorization. And but he'd come in during homeroom, and he'd just go over that list and go over that list, and then the next day he'd go into the next one. And once he got it, he remembered, and the alumni claim that you know, they'd come back years later, and he'd still recognize them. Now, I suspect he'd go through that yearbook before that reunion and recall, but even so, he had great recall. He did great things with the pool hall, which was much more popular in those days than it is today. We've got so many, the kids today have so many other outside activities, and even here, you know, new sports, racquetball, lacrosse, wrestling, on, and they're all, practically all of them. If you ask Dave Laughlin, he'll tell you 70 or 80% of these kids are involved in something. So it's not like they're just leaving and going home and hitting the books. They've all got, you know, things that they're doing. But in those days, that was not the case, and so that pool hall was much more popular, especially with the upperclassmen. And then he had those great rifle teams. He told me shortly before he died, he said, I can still get down on my knees and teach boys how to shoot, but I can't get up. So he gave it up.
How about Coach Martell?
I need to make one request. If you don't mind, please repeat the person's name that you're talking about.
Okay.
On your side, just so
Surely.
just so we have you saying it.
All right. Paul Martell and I started here in '59, and I remember my first impression of him, he took me to a game. We went scouting one night. And in those days, you know, they didn't have modern equipment. So he's sitting there with a pad and a pencil, and they'd run a play, and he would chart exactly where everybody was on the offense and defense, and he'd be ready to go as soon as the next play was going. So I said to him, I said, Paul, how do you do that? And he said, I don't know, I just see it. And I know in talking to kids, and even subsequently, I was talking to Fred Dawes, who was on his championship team, state champion, and Fred said the same thing was true at practice. When they'd run a play, he knew exactly where everybody was supposed to be. And even if the play wasn't going your way and you were out of position, he'd call you on it and make you do it again. Now, I'm sure you guys went through that same experience with him. Yeah, he had a remarkable ability when it came to football, and the adjustments. You know, he'd make kind of minute adjustments at halftime, and it made all the difference. He was just a master of strategy, and he was a very great man. You know, he was a good bridge player. And Teresa, we used to go out there. That was another of our watering holes. Kellett and I, and sometimes Durso, and play bridge with him. And Teresa was a whiz, and Paul was pretty good too. And good conversationalist. He'd talk forever, as you know, if you get him started on a topic. Good friends with the head coach at Rockhurst, who was another character, and I'm trying to recall his name, Al something. And Al won several state championships up there, and they'd come down. You remember they came down for basketball, I think it was. Well, Al was the athletic director there, and Paul here, and you get the two of them I saw that occur one day down in the rec room. They talked for like 4 hours, and it was just nonstop.
Could you comment on Father Sheehan?
Sheehan, Father Sheehan was and is the architect of the modern Jesuit curriculum, certainly in this school, and a lot of his ideas got copied elsewhere, because he put in the 1-8-1-8 program, whereby they can get college credit through St. Louis U, up to some of them are getting close to more than a year and a half even. He started that. He put in Chinese 50 years ago. He put in Russian. So he brought the modern languages into the curriculum. He strengthened the counseling program, AP programs, all of that. And that got copied throughout the Jesuit system of schools in the United States. He then became provincial, and he was the same way there. He's a very savvy guy. He saw very early on that these old buildings in out-of-way places, such as Florissant, and he was able to sell that. And there was one up in Decatur, Illinois, St. Joseph's, where they did tertianship, which was a third year of prayer and reflection, pastoral work, after ordination and after finishing theology. He was able to sell those, and he put those funds into what became the retirement fund for the Jesuits of the province. He was also a man who was, I recall there was a time when they were trying to decide where the theologates were going to go. They had, the 10 provincials had decided that they should get out of the boonies and get into the big cities. And so they put one in Boston at Harvard, and another one in California at Berkeley. But the third one was a debate. Should it go to Chicago? Should it go to St. Louis? And everybody said that Jerry was just very open to other arguments, and so Chicago got it. And I think that's one of the reasons he was, when he finished his 6 years as provincial, then he was called to Rome as, not immediately, he went to Colorado for a year as superior. Then he went to Rome as the American assistant to Father General, who was at that time Pedro Arrupe. And the role of the assistant is basically to conduct correspondence with everybody in the States and read all the correspondence from the States, and then decide what goes up to Father General and his council and what the assistant handles. And that involved being in Rome 6 months a year and traveling 6 months a year. So he would travel to the various provinces, and they'd try to visit 3 or 4 a year of the 10 provinces just to follow up. And that's the way they kept communication between Father General and all the other Jesuit apostolates. So it's a very responsible job. He did that for 12 years. Then he came back here, and he was back at SLUH as superior. He was a very good man, great sense of humor, very tough as a principal. And but when he became provincial, he was dealing with Jesuits only, and almost like a different person. And he was that way when he was in the community here when we were scholastics. He liked a good joke. One of the things we all used to do, in those days they locked up the beer at 6 o'clock, and Brother Tommy Thornton lived just downstairs. And he'd always leave his pants on a chair right next to the door with the keys. And about 9 o'clock, Kellett and Doyle and Bill Kane and Sheehan and several of the scholastics, we'd go in and we'd have a beer. And Father Jake, who was the superior and who locked up the building, he never came. He knew exactly what was going on. He never went to the kitchen after dark. You wouldn't see Jake in there. He didn't want to know.
Was that out of mind, huh? Yeah. And you were here for how long at St. Lucie High?
Well, I was here 3 years as a scholastic, and then I came back after, well, I did theology, then I did a year of study abroad, then I did a year of internship with a guy by the name of Mark Link, who's a Chicago Jesuit, who's written a lot of little books. You may have seen some of the prayer books, Challenge and things like that. Very good teacher, very good man. And then I went to DeSmet, and then Sheehan dragged me into administration because he was stuck. And I hadn't been trained in that, and he decided that that I was going to be interim principal, because the previous principal, who had been trained, he left the church and the society. Well, he didn't leave the church, but he left the society and the priesthood to get married. And Sheehan was stuck. He didn't have anybody else. So he said, just don't do anything dumb, and you can call me at any time. You can call Bailey, who was here, and a guy by the name of Jim Reinert, Paul Reinert, the great president of St. Louis University, his younger brother. Jim was the assistant to Sheehan, so he was kind of an assistant provincial. And he had been a principal in a school that we had in Wichita, Kansas called Capon. So I had that kind of to rely on. And then after 5 years there, I came back here from 74 to 79 as principal, and then I went to Regis for 16 years as president. And then I came back here in 95.
And are you an associate now, or?
No, I do whatever Laughlin asks me to do, but I have this title called Assistant to the President for Mission. Well, first of all, he doesn't really need any help in that regard. He reads all the documents of the popes. He reads all the stuff the general writes on education and so on. He's better read in that than I am. And he can articulate it. If you've ever heard him speak, you know that. He's very good at articulating the Jesuit mission. So basically, I do whatever. I go to hospitals and funerals, and sometimes he comes along. Last year, I did some traveling with people like Ben Dumont and people on the third floor, and Dave. Last year it was fairly extensive because I was here as a kid, I was here as a scholastic, I was here in the 70s, now I've been back for 20 years. So I know a good number of the alums. And so I'm helpful to them, I think, in that respect. I told them when we started this, I said, I'll be happy to go, but you got to do the heavy lifting, namely the asking. I'm willing to go and smile and shake hands, but that's his job. So he's a great man. We're lucky to have him.
The feeling or the phrase "men for others," how do you keep that alive? I mean, to me, after having graduated in '64, it still feels like it's very much a part of the school. And how do you consciously or subconsciously keep that?
John Moran, the principal, is very good at that. He's constantly quoting some of those characteristics to them. I think the service program, though, is a concrete way of getting that done. And I don't know, I haven't looked at the numbers this year, I don't know what it is. I know all the freshmen now go on service. The seniors, as you know, go out for a month. They're gone. The rest of the service programs are pretty much on the kids' time. And a number of them will go back even when they fulfill whatever requirements there are. They'll continue it. They get good relations with some of these people and they continue that. So I think service is a very concrete way of keeping that notion alive.
Maybe a corollary to that is how do you keep the Jesuit feeling?
Yes, and a component of that is reflection. Because otherwise, if you're just doing service, anybody can do that. You can be a purely humanistic person. So we always want them to try to reflect on that service in the light of the gospel. We have prayer services every week. Each class has a day for prayer service. We have liturgies. We have all school liturgies on the big deals like Ash Wednesday and before Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter and all that. But then we have class masses also. Each quarter, every class gets together. And then there are certain ad hoc masses. Some of the coaches are very good at that. The coaches, particularly in football, Gary, he's been bringing them to First Friday stuff with their parents, the dads. And that's probably a popular thing. And then they have donuts afterward in the Kerrigan room. So there are all those ways. And hopefully, they're getting, in social studies, they're getting a sense of serving the neighbor and a better grasp on some of these complex issues that relate to that. And likewise in theology. I used to, on Fridays, and it gives them a break. So frequently on Fridays, I take them into the chapel, put on some music, Bach or something like that. Sometimes things like the Messiah, Handel's Messiah, classical music, or even Enya, the kids love Enya. And then I'd just prepare a scripture passage, and I'd have reflection questions, and they'd have to write those, and then they hand them in at the end of the period, and I'd tell them, I'm not going to grade these, but I will read them and write comments. So that's another way of getting in their heads. And some of the theology teachers do what they call journaling, make them keep a notebook, and it's the same thing. And then you collect the notebooks regularly, and you comment. If you're going to do that, it's going to be time consuming because you got to give them comments back and keep that dialogue going. And frequently they will say things in the journal that they won't say in a classroom in front of the other kids. So that's a way of individualizing it a little bit.
I was looking at one of the bulletin boards downstairs and was somewhat surprised and pleasantly surprised to see that there's a time set aside each day for the examen.
Yes.
Which was from
125
to 126 or
Yeah.
How long has that been?
We put that in about 5 or 6 years ago. And we got that, I think Brophy started that before the other, Brophy's a Jesuit school in Phoenix, and they started that, and Laughlin was out there for a meeting, and he observed this whole campus came to a stop for a couple of minutes. And so then we implemented it here. And that's another little way to kind of get them to review the day and a reminder.
could you describe the changes over the years that you've seen, quite a history here academically? What are
I think the
biggest
school
changes?
today is better. I have said this to alumni groups everywhere, from Boston to San Francisco, and I think it's correct. Sheehan agreed with me at one point too before he died. I had 27, in the 70s, I had 27 Jesuits in the school. The school today is better academically, and I think in some ways faith-wise than it was then, even though there were only 5 Jesuits. So that the key to that is not the numbers. The key to that is the quality of the lives of the faculty. And that means a couple of things. You got to pay them, and you got to screen them well. And it's interesting, I was talking to somebody, they're hiring an additional counselor next year. They had 124 applicants for one spot. So you can see that, and that's not atypical. We had the same thing with English a couple of years ago. Now, the economy or lack thereof contributes to that, in the current time. But in general, the principle is the same, that you got to be pretty careful in how you screen, and if you get the right people, then it'll work. And if you don't, you're in trouble. I was speaking to a diocesan priest who taught somewhere else and hasn't been in teaching, and he's very concerned about that. And we were talking about this same thing. But it requires time on the part of the principal, or he can delegate that to the department head usually, and John has a very complicated process, but I think it's very good. For example, when we picked a new athletic director, again, it was the same thing. We had something like 120 applicants, and John Moran went through and read all those applications, and they were all online. And then he said, qualified, overqualified, not qualified. And I happened to be on the committee, and he gave us all that. I read only one of the non-qualified just to get a sample. But you end up reading about 60 resumes. Then we had a meeting of the committee, and we said, we think there are 6 or 7 of these guys that we really liked, that we agreed on. So then they brought them in, the ones that were in town for interviews, and the 2 guys that were out of town, they did by Skype. So we did those interviews, and then we cut it down to 2. And then they were interviewed. And then after we did that, then the coaches got to interview those 2 guys as a group. Then they met separately with the athletic director and the assistant athletic director. Then they met with Dave and with Moran separately, and then they picked Chris Muscop. So it can be a fairly elaborate process. It takes some time, but you have to do things like that to ensure the quality of your faculty, which guarantees then that you're going to be able to promote the mission.
Why do you think the school fosters such long-time relationships between the alumni, yourselves, and the school? What is it that, in your mind?
The grace of God. Well, I think that one of the characteristics of Jesuit education is what they call cura personalis, the care for the individual. And I think there's been a history of that here, going way back to Father John Devine, who's another hero here, really, who goes unnoticed, who did an awful lot of stuff here. Part of it, though, is, as I say, so there's certainly that. And I know that Dave is very good, for example, if a kid's father dies, he immediately contacts the family and says, if you can't afford the tuition, we don't want you to leave, blah, blah, blah. Stuff like that. Hagen was good at that. Taking an interest in the kids' lives, meaning not only personal conversations, but I think that's why attendance at their events is important, because it shows that you're interested in them as a person, not just in the classroom or as a number or some guy in your class. And then the grace thing. I was reading Dave Sawalski's written a short history. And I didn't quite realize it at the time, but until I read that. Mrs. Backer, when she gave all the money for the school, said that she wanted this to be a school where we would get vocations. And Laughlin and I had studied that previously for a couple of other purposes. There have been over 300, and that's Joe Packey tells me that's a lowball number, but there have been over 300 vocations from this school, both to the society and to the diocese. And I think there are currently something like 84 living Jesuits in the province, in our province, who are alumni of this school. So there's always been kind of a tight relationship here. But then when I read that thing about Mrs. Backer, and I thought, oh my gosh, she kind of foresaw some of this, and I don't know what else she said to the powers that be at that time. But I think that's a factor in it. And that goes, she herself, they tell me, was here a lot. She'd come to football games, she attended Mothers Club's teas, on and on and on. So she kind of set a good example in terms of being involved in the school, and I think the faculty is that way. Mary Lee was here earlier. Somebody interviewed her, Mary Lee, Dr. McConaughey. She used to spend most of her Christmas holidays writing college recommendations for kids. That kind of stuff goes a long way.
One last question I have, unless none of the other gentlemen have any questions, is when you were here as a student, scholastic and priest, who had the biggest effect on your career?
Johnny Doyle, Father John Doyle. He was, we called him, and when we were scholastics, we called him the Great Emancipator, because he had freed all the seniors from homework. But he was not a good teacher, but he was a terrific person. Very pastoral, very spiritual guy. And he had this incredible devotion to his guardian angel, whom we called Mike. And so he didn't drive. Well, Papa Phil didn't either. So he'd come over to the cage and say, it'd be before a game or something, and he'd look around and say, well, what are you doing now? I said, we're pretty well set. We're going to leave in a half hour or so. He said, well, can you run me up to the station? I said, what happened to Mike today? He said, well, I don't have enough time. But sometimes he'd just get out there and start walking, and people, of course, he'd have his collar and they'd pick him up, and he'd always say, well, that's my guardian angel and so on. He'd go to, in the summer, he'd go to St. Mary's for a week to work with the sick, and he'd come back with these stories of these people that he met, and just incredible storyteller, great retreat giver, and a very nice guy. And in fact, I asked him to preach at my first Mass, and unfortunately, that was in June of '65, and by that time he was in the hospital with terminal cancer. He died in July of that month, but he couldn't even come to the Mass. He was not able to get out of bed. Great sense of humor. He called a nurse one day, and she was slow in coming, and he said, well, thank you for coming, because he said, I think I'm going to rust to death.
I do have a question, Father Houlihan, and that is regarding the direction of the Society of Jesus in general. Up until the General Council 32, Second Vatican Council, and Pedro Rupe, I think the wisdom of the Jesuits was to educate the bright people to try and help bright leaders lead society. With the Second Vatican Council and with many others, Pedro Rupe dramatically changed the mission of the Jesuits. How did that impact the high school here, or did it?
Well, I don't know that he dramatically changed it. Ignatius, Lainez, and who was the other guy at Trent? Salmeron, maybe, were true theologians at the Council of Trent. Theologians. Ecumenical Council. He had them working in the hospitals with the poor and the dying, spending a lot of time there. So that concern for the poor was very close to Ignatius's heart. I would say though, and I think that's long been true here. This place has been, we talk about it more now, needs blind admission. But that was the case even when I was a student here. If somebody really needed the money, they got in if they had the ability. We integrated the school in 1946, right after Cardinal Ritter asked all the schools to do that. And we didn't have a lot of blacks in those days as we do now. So it's certainly true that Vatican II gave impetus to that, and it's certainly true that we have more African American kids now than we did then, and that's deliberate. And I think the reason for that is the studies show the black male is still the most at-risk person in this culture. And so just as we gave upward mobility to a lot of Anglo-Saxon kids in the early days of this school who were poor, we're trying to do the same thing with those kids, provided they're qualified. They have to be qualified to handle this curriculum. Otherwise, you're not doing them any favors, and you run the risk of using them in the sense, I put it analogous to somebody that's just recruiting black kids so they can have good athletic teams. I think that's immoral. Unless, now if they're educating them, okay, maybe that's okay. But if they're not educating those kids, and we've all known examples of that, then in my view, that's wrong.
Well, thank you very much for spending
Thank you
time with
guys
us
for
and helping the archives.
posing all these questions and for working on the archives, as you are.
Our pleasure.
And we're all waiting to see with expectation. I was asking him about Dismas Clark earlier, because a kid came in yesterday wanting to know all about that. And he's got, he actually had a copy, the newspaper bought him a copy, because the school didn't have one, of the Hoodlum Priest, which is all about Dismas Clark, who taught here for a couple of years. So I answered the questions I could, which weren't very many. And I was talking to Bob earlier, and he said, Bob St. Vrain, he said, yeah, they've got some stuff. So I told that kid, Ethan McIntyre, that he ought to check with the archive guys. They'd be here today, and they could probably help him. He's going to write an article for the paper on Friday.
Thank you, Father.
Okay, are we done?
I believe so.
Well, that was painless.